It is so exciting being the first talk right after lunch because everyone's all like well-fed and rested and full of energy, which is amazing because I'm going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, meetings. I can tell from the reaction that that's probably not everyone's actual favorite topic. It is for me, though. I actually really love a well-run meeting, which does work out well for me because I work at Fellow, where we're building a management productivity platform for meetings. So that works out really well. But I still, as much as I love meetings, find that I spend too much time in them, like probably most of the people here too. And so I'm always trying to find ways that I can reduce the number of meetings I go to, or the amount of time that I spend in meetings so that I can spend more time with my team. And so one of the ways that I found to do that is by hosting asynchronous meetings. And before jumping into what that is, I find the engineer in me, whenever I hear the word async, I think of async tasks. And so async meetings, originally when I heard this, I was thinking like, oh, so you have like 4 or 5 meetings at the same time and you like listen one and then talk in the other and like jump back and forth, as opposed to synchronous meetings, which is what we actually do, where it's one after the other, which is totally inefficient in comparison. But that's not what async meetings is. Before jumping into what specifically async meetings are, though, I want to talk about how it's something that I discovered and how I realized that this is something that I needed in my work life. And that starts with retrospectives. Retros, if you haven't done them before, they're this really great type of meeting where you look back over a period of time and talk with your team about what went well, what didn't go so well, and come up with action items to figure out how you can get better in the future. So I love these. They're really great at making positive change. And I run retros with the engineering organization at Fellow every 6 months. Quick side note before getting into retros, but you can't have a good retro without having a good theme. And I always have these categories of like good, bad, and very bad so that we know how to categorize our thoughts. And yeah, none of our themes ever really make sense. So for this particular retro we did in December 2019, I went with the theme Squirrel, Mouse, Rat, which probably falls into the very bad category for most people. But squirrel is actually good. Long story short, there was someone on the team who was new to Canada, where I'm from, and I don't know if it's the same in England, but in Canada we have lots and lots of squirrels running around everywhere, and that wasn't the case for where this person was from, and he thought squirrels are amazing, and so we went with squirrels as our good category, and mice are just slightly better than rats, I guess. So for this retro, December 2019, it was a really fun activity. Like, we got the entire dev team together in a room. We were writing on Post-it notes. We were putting them up on the wall, putting stickers, like running into each other and trying to read each other's scribbly handwriting. And it was a really good use of, like, we spent the whole afternoon doing this. It was 4 hours of just talking and getting things done. There were like cookies and chocolates and things to keep the energy going. And it was really good. 6 months later, it was June 2020, and so we were all working remotely. I've actually been working remotely for the last 10 years, so at this point it was the last 8 years or so, and I figured, like, I know how to use a virtual whiteboard, I know how to use a video call, so I got this. I'll just do the exact same thing virtually. And it was horrible. We spent 4 entire hours on this video call together, and I still feel so bad that I made everyone do that. I think we had 1 break in the middle, but everyone stuck around, and we were just going through exactly the same motions that we were doing in person, and it was really bad. I asked for feedback later. It's the retro after the retro. Asking for feedback on anything is amazing because people always have different opinions than you think. And yeah, the consensus was that this was terrible. Nobody really wants to do it again. And for some reason, also, one of the main points of feedback is that I didn't provide cookies for this remote retro. I can't blame them. I probably would have been upset too if I had not, after having cookies on the in-person retro. Anyway, this got me thinking, like, there's got to be a better way. I want to keep doing these retros because they're still very important to do, especially when your team has gone through a lot of change like we did when we went remotely. But I didn't want to spend 4 hours in a meeting just to do this, and clearly nobody else did either. So it got me thinking, what if we could run this whole meeting without actually having the meeting. And so like I said, I work at Fellow, where we're building meeting productivity software. And one of the really cool things about that is that we get to use our own software. So everybody in the company who has a meeting, which is everybody, gets to come up with their own insights for how the product should work and see those through into the product. But what we also know is that if we do that too much, we're going to end up building something that works really well for our way of working, which isn't really great because other people have very different ways of working, and we don't want to enforce our way onto everyone. And so what we do is we have these week-long experiment weeks. And so for an entire week, the entire company will operate in a totally different way so that we can see what it's like to work at other companies. One of those experiments that we did was having an async meeting week. And it was interesting. So we just decided every single meeting that we have this week is going to be asynchronous. And we weren't really told what that meant. Somebody said when that was announced that I feel like having the async meetings week means that I'm just not going to participate in any meetings, which is not ideal. It kind of went that way for some people. But on the positive side, I mean, having an async meeting week meant that everyone had more time back, especially the people like me, where my schedule is just basically completely filled with meetings. And it made it easier for everyone else to actually get up away from their computer and like go on a walk, because you don't have to be back by a certain time to have a meeting and stuff. On the other side, though, it was kind of a nightmare because nobody was told what async means, and everybody had to come up with their own definition of what it means and try to communicate that to people for every single meeting we had. And it meant that there were many, many different definitions of it. And so if you have an async meeting, that means that there's a time slot on the calendar, but what does that mean? Like, that's kind of up for interpretation. So sometimes we had like meetings that would start on Monday, and then the discussions would just continue on to Friday because nobody was sure, is the meeting where we're supposed to talk? Are we supposed to start talking then? Is that a deadline? So it was kind of a little bit hectic. But it got me wondering, we already have async communication, which we're all familiar with. It's Slack and email and things like that. Definitely starting to be like a little bit more popular in the last few years because it's specifically good for people who work in different time zones so that you don't have to coordinate and talk real time. But if we have async communication, why do we also need async meetings? Like, why is that a separate thing? And if we have async communication already, like, what does the meeting on a calendar mean? Why isn't async communication just enough? And I was really curious in that difference. But even though we were kind of confused about all of this, we did start to notice that this week, no matter how hectic it was, did have a lot of positive impact on some different types of meetings that we had. So anything that was very update-driven, like check-ins or town halls and things like that, those are really good because our async version of that would include like maybe videos someone had uploaded. And so we didn't all have to sit on a call together and listen to someone talk. We could watch a video whenever we wanted at like 2x speed and just kind of like skip to the parts we want to watch. So that was kind of good. And we also noticed by doing this that we were already doing some of our meetings somewhat async already. So one of the types of meetings that I run are these team check-ins. And so check-in sounds a lot like chicken, so we call them team chickens. We have a lot of animal-themed things at the company, a lot in engineering. Nobody should have ever put me in charge of anything. It is all like this. But we have these team check-ins where it's kind of like a stand-up, but nobody actually likes stand-ups. And so we have a time in the calendar, and that kind of acts as a deadline by which people have to have written in a note saying what they're doing for the day. People can read it if they want. And then we use the time slot in the calendar to actually just like catch up and socialize and have fun, which is really good when you're working remotely. I was also very interested in this because like running a great meeting is super, super important to any company, organization, group of people, because there's just such a critical cost to them. And this is both a financial cost, like it literally, if you have a group of people in a room for an hour, that's their like hourly salary or whatever. So you have a very real financial cost. But the bigger thing too is there's a focus cost to meetings as well. So if you have an hour-long meeting in the afternoon, people aren't just spending that 1 hour doing the meeting instead of other stuff. they're spending the hour plus the half hour before ramping up for it, the half hour ramping down from it. And so you'll end up taking away time from people when they could have been working on other things, which is super important for engineers in particular who need a lot of back-to-back time to focus on writing code and doing those things that require a lot of brain power. So all of this got me thinking, I want to figure out how to build the perfect asynchronous meeting, because this seems like a really good way of taking time out of meetings and giving it back to people on the team. This is also a topic that I cover in a book that I've written that's coming out later this summer called Remote Engineering Management. And this is a book I've written that covers all of the lessons, mistakes, failures, best practices, and things that I've come across in the last 10 years of working remotely. And I'm really excited for this. It's a very people-first, empathetic look into engineering management. And I cover things from when you're hiring, the remote-specific biases that you should be looking out for, how to make sure you're giving fair feedback to people when you're not seeing them in person all the time, all the way to how to let someone go remotely in an empathetic way. So it's going to be available soon, but if you want to sign up for a notification when it comes out, you can do so at my website, alexandras.dev/book. All right, so what actually is an async meeting? That would be a good thing to cover. So in order to do this, it's probably best to illustrate with an example. So I'm going to show what I did for that remote retro when for the retro, the remote one, so the second time when it was actually async properly. Very important side note again, the theme for this one was snow, rain, ice. Makes just as much sense as the first one. Snow is great because I'm Canadian, so snow lets us go snowshoeing and skiing and snowball fights and all that stuff, so snow is amazing. Rain is not so good because it washes away the snow and then we can't have fun anymore. But it's not the end of the world. And ice is a very contentious one because on the one hand, we can play hockey, and what's more Canadian than hockey? But on the other hand, when ice is on the sidewalk, it's very dangerous, and so everyone had a different idea of what order these should be in, but this is what we went with. All right, so there's a lot of coordination that goes into async meetings as opposed to, there should be a lot of coordination that goes into regular meetings as well, but you can kind of get away with just showing up and hoping they go over well. Not really recommended, but async meetings definitely do need that preparation ahead of time. And for this retro in particular, the things that I shared were the timeline, the logistics, the expectations, and of course, the retro board. So starting with the timeline, the way that I decided to break this up, so the first retro I did, it was just show up to the retro, we'll go through it together, spend 4 hours, and that's it. For this one, I broke it up into 3 separate steps. So the first one, day A, this is a deadline about a week after I've actually announced the retro, and this is the date by when everybody has to have written out their thoughts, so written out on Post-it notes, virtual Post-it notes, and made those available for everyone to see. So you have a whole week to think about this and do that. Day B is about a week after day A, and that's the deadline by which everyone has to have commented on those virtual Post-it notes and voted. So if there's something that you really agree with, you put a thumbs up. If there's something you have thoughts on or have questions about, then you comment there. Day C is an hour-and-a-half sync retro. So this is an actual video call. And this is the nice part. So this part would have been the full retro before, but it went from 4 hours all the way down to an hour-and-a-half. And part of that's because we got to pull out some of the the more thought work involved. So the writing on Post-it notes and things, those tasks were pulled out. But the real benefit here is that because day A and day B were taken out and we had these 2 weeks to write things and write comments and think about things, the retro itself, where we actually talk about these things, got to be so much shorter because everyone had the time to think about what they wanted to say beforehand and read through the comments. And also it's kind of nice because if there's something that somebody puts on there, I don't like the retro theme this time, you could just check it off. We don't have to talk about it. So that made it easier. The next part for this is logistics. So this is where you have to share everything around, like, if you have a timeline, where are you going to find it? Where are people supposed to write out their thoughts? How are you supposed to vote and comment? And so this is specific to the retro, but for any asynchronous meeting, you would need logistics saying, like, this is how the meeting is actually going to be run, and this is the format and medium in which you're supposed to be putting this content. There we go. Next, expectations. I think that every meeting should have expectations because it makes them run so much more smoothly. Just having everyone show up knowing what is expected of them, how they're supposed to participate, what they should be saying, that makes things go a lot better. And for retros in particular, the one part I always tell people is you should criticize things and not people. The one exception to that being if they want to criticize me and my choice of themes, that is more than allowed. All right, and specifically for the retro board needs to be shared. If you are thinking of doing this kind of thing, I would suggest using like Miro or Figma or just any kind of like virtual board like that that has comments and reactions. We use Fellow because we're going to use our own thing. It is very handy for us because it's attached to the meeting, and so it's like everyone has access to it really easily, and you can put the timeline and all that info in there. And we have reactions and comments, but yeah, sometimes it's nice seeing things in an actual whiteboard format, which we do not do. So we ran this retro, and the feedback was night and day. Like, it was already an hour and a half, which made that made the comments there quite a bit better. But it was so good. Like, everyone was able to pay attention the whole time. The energy level was so much better because the full hour and a half that we spent was talking about the most important things, because we took the parts that don't necessarily need to be talked about and moved them asynchronously. And so this went really well. I think people brought their own cookies this time, so I didn't get any comments on that. Yeah, so given that, how should you go about actually building your own asynchronous meeting? And you probably noticed from what I said too, I say asynchronous meeting, and then I also showed a synchronous meeting, and that probably doesn't really make sense. But I really believe that asynchronous meetings don't actually need to be 100% async. I'm never gonna vouch for like moving all your meetings to async either. There are always discussions that are faster and better and more in depth and just easier to do when you're actually talking to each other. And the retro is one of those cases. Like, if you want to talk about some incident that happened or something, that's just going to be really hard to do asynchronously. And so I do think that like async meetings are ones where a lot of the work should be moved asynchronously, but still deserve a small portion to remain actually synchronous. So the first step to do this is to start off by figuring out which parts of the meeting should be asynchronous. And the best parts for this are anything where you're pushing information or absorbing updates from people. So things like in the retro, we were all thinking of ideas, writing it out on Post-its, that kind of thing where it's like busy work, anything where you would be in a meeting with people and it would be silent because everyone's doing something and it's kind of awkward. That stuff is really good asynchronous. The next step is creating a timeline. And you might have a multi-step async meeting like the retro. It might be a two-step thing where you just like everyone has to read something and then everyone goes to the meeting. But no matter what, you have to be very deliberate in creating the timeline for this, because you still want people to benefit from the fact that something is async. And async, at its core, I think the main benefits from it are that you get to do it at whatever point during the day you want to do. And if you have something where like you have to do something in the morning and then the next step is in the afternoon, that's not really async, because then everyone's forced to do the thing in the middle during those two times, and that's not giving anyone the benefit of async. The next part is setting and sharing an agenda. Also not specific to async meetings. All meetings should have agendas, and if you have a meeting that doesn't have an agenda, I think that's a good reason to just not go to the meeting. But this is a really great place to write down those expectations and timeline and make sure that it's a spot where people are going to take notes, and should be like really easily accessible for everyone who's going to it, and have like it should be the source of truth of everything that happens for both the async and synchronous portions of this meeting. So there are a lot of benefits to async meetings, and two of the more commonly known obvious ones are that it works for people in multiple time zones, which is decently relevant now, and also that financial cost where the less time you spend actually in meetings, the less of that financial and focus costs you have. But the two that I think are really special are the first one, more time for thought. So when you have an async meeting, like with this retro, is so nice because you have the first step where you get to think about what you want to say, the next step where you get to think about what others have written, and then the next step later where you actually talk about those things. And I find having things broken up that way and having an entire week to think about what it is you want to talk about and how you want to respond to something makes a huge difference in the quality of conversations that we have. So I really appreciate that. I'm the type of person where someone will ask me, what do you think of the upcoming plan for projects we want to do, and I'm not going to have an answer, and I'm going to have to schedule another meeting for the next day once I've thought of it. So there's that benefit, and then also the context is accessible, because when you're creating an async meeting, you're going to put probably a little bit more effort into putting together the agenda and the notes and writing out the context for everyone, since everyone has to absorb that information on their own asynchronously, as opposed to a meeting where you might write out a few agenda points and then just give the rest of the context verbally when everyone's in the room. So because you have an async meeting, that context is written down. And so in the future, 6 months later, when you want to look back and see what was discussed and what people were talking about, there's going to be more stuff there to absorb, and you're going to have an easier time getting caught up with what was said. Sync meetings are also great, though. I do not want to move everything to async and sync, so actual meetings have a very good place as well. For one, they require a lot less coordination, so you don't have to create that timeline, you don't have to think about all the different steps and whatnot. You just, for the most part, create an agenda, show up, take some notes, so it's a lot easier that way. And there are a lot of discussions that just can't happen asynchronously. They're just better to have in real time. They'd require too much back and forth, and it's just easier to get on a quick call or see each other in person and do things that way. And there are some meetings in particular where I think it really is beneficial to stick specifically to synchronous meetings, and that's anything where you're doing a lot of relationship building. So in particular, one-on-ones. Those are meetings where, yes, you will talk about work, but they're, for the most part, opportunities for you to build trust with your manager and your direct reports. And that's the type of thing that's kind of difficult to do when you're talking to each other or writing back and forth or sending videos or whatever method you use for async communication. So that's the kind of meeting where I will always do them async, and they are better that way. Same with team meetings. A lot of that, it is a little bit more work-focused than one-on-ones maybe, but those are really, really important for building trust between all of the different team members, and so it's important to keep those synchronous. I find a really good exercise to do is to look at your calendar and think of which meetings on there could be moved asynchronously, because when you do that, you have to really think hard about the purpose of the meeting, what it is you talk about, why each person's there, because you're trying to break it up into asynchronous steps and figure out which parts can be pulled out of the meeting. And so by doing that, you're thinking hard about, do I actually need this meeting? What's the purpose? And so I find you'll save time just by default, because you'll go through your calendar and realize oh, this meeting that's been on the calendar all year, I don't actually need that to exist anymore. So you will save some time there. I also talked a lot about remote teams. I mean, I have worked remote forever. I did work hybrid and in office for a brief stretch of time, but I do want to emphasize that async meetings is not just a remote thing. It's actually very, very useful for teams that work together in person as well. And if anything, you'll save even more time if you switch to async meetings when you're in person, because you save the time that you would have spent in the meeting by canceling it, and you'll save the 2 minutes it takes to get to the conference room and back. So I'll leave you with this. If you take away just one thing from my talk today, let it be that you're like the managerial catchphrase many of us use. Instead of saying, let's take this offline when we're trying to like end a meeting short and move things around and get out of that call, let it go from let's take this offline to let's take this async. Thank you.